Before we begin, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Thank you. The Valyrian High Command had deployed exactly 500 warships to track down a single human being, and Commander Zathik couldn't shake the nagging thought that it still might not be sufficient. 3 rotations ago, that thought would have been absurd. Before the catastrophe at Kepler Station, before they had witnessed firsthand what humans were truly capable of when driven into a corner. Before everything the Galactic Council believed it understood about this species had proven to be not just wrong, but dangerously, fatally wrong. Zathik's 4 claws tapped rhythmically against the command console as he studied the tactical reports one last time. The target was a human male named Jake. No family name, no military designation, no titles of any significance. According to the Federation database, he had worked as an ordinary maintenance technician aboard a commercial cargo vessel. Nothing in his file pointed to anything beyond the baseline timidity the Council had long since come to expect from his kind. The Valyrians had developed a habit of expecting very little from humans in general. When first contact had been established with the Terran Federation 60 cycles ago, humanity had seemed almost painfully eager to accommodate. They had proposed trade arrangements that heavily favored their partners, accepted territorial surrenders without raising a single objection, and met every diplomatic insult with patience and concession. Weak-spirited, the Council had declared, useful for labor and resource extraction, but lacking the fundamental character required for true participation in galactic civilization. It was precisely this assessment that had given birth to the Kepler Accords. A trade agreement so grotesquely imbalanced, it was barely distinguishable from outright exploitation. The humans would supply raw materials, agricultural goods, and technological services to 12 different species in exchange for practically nothing. Token payments, a handful of outdated star charts, a modest quantity of surplus medical equipment. The humans had signed without a word of protest. For 60 cycles, the arrangement had functioned flawlessly. Human vessels arrived on schedule at designated coordinates, their cargo holds filled with refined metals, processed provisions, and complex electronics. They asked no questions when their compensation was slashed by administrative deductions or quality disputes. They filed no grievances when shipments vanished or arrived weeks late. From the Valyrian perspective, it was an ideal arrangement. The humans performed the labor and everyone else collected the reward. The only peculiarity was the human insistence on handling every delivery personally. No automated cargo drops, no remote transfers. Always a human crew, always a direct handoff. The Council had written it off as some primitive cultural tradition. Perhaps humans needed the affirmation of face-to-face contact to feel purposeful. They were partially correct about the need for direct contact, though they had entirely misunderstood the reason for it. The incident at Kepler Station had begun like every other routine transfer before it. A human freight hauler, designated Long Road Home, had arrived with a hold packed with processed titanium and rare earth elements. Captain Hector, a graying human male with tired, weathered eyes, had requested docking clearance and initiated standard offloading procedures. Then complications arose. Kepler Station's commanding officer, a Valyrian named Vorak, had elected to introduce new security protocols. The human crew would be detained and processed through interrogation, while their cargo was confiscated pending inspection. It was theft, of course. Little more than piracy dressed in the language of bureaucracy, but the humans had never objected to such irregularities before. What was one more transgression? Captain Hector had stood in the docking bay watching as Valyrian security forces seized control of his ship and herded his crew toward detention cells. His weathered face had remained carefully expressionless, but something buried deep in his eyes had made Commander Vorak stop and take notice. "Is there a problem, human?" Vorak had asked, his mandibles clicking with amusement. "No problem," Hector had replied, his voice low and measured. "I was simply wondering whether you were absolutely certain about this course of action." The question had struck Vorak as peculiar. What could a human possibly do about any of this? They were outnumbered 50 to 1, outgunned, and trapped inside an alien installation, and yet something in the man's tone had caused the commander's scales to prickle with faint unease. "I am certain," Vorak had declared. "Your cargo will be thoroughly examined." Captain Hector had nodded slowly. Then he had reached into his jacket and withdrawn a small communication device. With unhurried deliberateness, he had snapped it cleanly in half. The meaning of this gesture had been entirely lost on everyone present. including Vorak. Only later would they come to understand what that broken communicator had signified. It was a dead man's switch, a failsafe, a final message dispatched to unknown recipients containing coordinates, status informations, and 3 simple words: accords are void. But that understanding would arrive far too late to save Commander Vorak, or Kepler Station, or the 537 Valyrians who had made it their home. The human crew had been processed through detention with the same passive compliance they had always demonstrated. They answered questions when addressed, submitted to searches without resistance, and offered no opposition as the cell doors sealed behind them. Jake, the maintenance technician, had been placed in cell block C alongside 11 other humans. He appeared to be roughly 30 cycles old by human reckoning, average height, brown hair, features that drew no particular attention. His psychological profile flagged him as compliant and non-aggressive. The guards had barely acknowledged him as they locked the door. For 18 hours, the humans had remained in their cells without incident. They spoke in hushed tones, exchanged old stories and worn-out jokes. Some slept. Others stared at the walls with the hollow expressions of resignation that the Valyrians had come to regard as entirely predictable. The attack had begun at 0347 station time. Jake had been the first to move. One moment he sat cross-legged on his bunk with his eyes closed, appearing almost meditative. The next he was standing at the cell door, running his fingers along the locking mechanism, with a focus that bordered on reverence. The electronic lock had been military-grade, designed to contain the most dangerous prisoners in the known galaxy. It incorporated 17 separate failsafes, quantum encryption, and biometric scanners capable of detecting unauthorized tampering from 3 systems away. Jake had opened it using his fingernails and what appeared to be a fragment of chewed protein bar. The process had taken him 47 seconds. He had freed the remaining humans with equivalent efficiency, moving through the detention level like a shadow with intent. The guards had found their posts abandoned, and their security systems reporting all clear status. It had taken them precious minutes to realize that 12 humans were now loose aboard their station. By then, Jake and his companions had already reached the armory. The Valyrians had always taken pride in their military hardware. Their pulse rifles could penetrate starship hulls. Their shock grenades could incapacitate entire boarding parties. Their powered armor transformed ordinary soldiers into mobile siege platforms. The humans had surveyed the weapons and set them aside entirely. Instead, Jake had begun disassembling the station's waste processing infrastructure. What followed was 23 minutes of methodical devastation that would haunt survivors' dreams for cycles to come. The humans had moved through Kepler Station with a precision that spoke of extensive planning, and with a ruthlessness that contradicted everything anyone believed about their pacifist reputation. They had not killed indiscriminately. They had not inflicted suffering for its own sake. They had simply removed every obstacle between themselves and their vessel with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon excising diseased tissue. The fact that those obstacles happened to be living beings, seeming almost incidental to the objective. The most disturbing element, from the Valyrian perspective, was the way the humans had turned the station's own systems against its inhabitants. Waste processing conduits became weapons. Atmospheric recyclers became delivery mechanisms for toxic gas. Emergency bulkheads became crushing instruments. Jake had demonstrated a working knowledge of Valyrian engineering that exceeded most Valyrian engineers. He had converted their home into a death trap, using tools never designed as weapons, and knowledge he should never have possessed. When the surviving security forces had finally cornered the human crew, in Docking Bay 7, they had found Captain Hector standing calmly beside his recovered vessel, hands empty, expression serene. Behind him, Jake and the others had been loading the last of their confiscated cargo. "Stand down," Commander Vorak had ordered, his weapon leveled at the human captain. "Surrender now, and your deaths will be swift." Captain Hector had tilted his head slightly. "Dents? You have killed 312 Valyrian citizens," Vorak had snarled. "Oh, there will be consequences," Hector had agreed, his voice unhurried, "just not the kind you're anticipating." It was then that the station's sensors had detected incoming vessels. Not the modest human freight haulers the Valyrians had grown comfortable seeing, but something else entirely. Something that registered on their instruments as impossibly massive and moving at velocities that challenged several established principles of physics. The long road home had departed Kepler Station without further incident. Commander Vorik had been too stunned by the sensor readings to mount any response. His weapons remained trained on empty space as the human ship vanished into hyperspace, leaving behind a station full of the dead and a constellation of questions that would reverberate through the halls of the Galactic Council for cycles to come. The investigation had consumed weeks. Forensic specialists from a dozen species had examined every centimeter of Kepler Station, attempting to reconstruct what had happened. How had 12 humans, 12 supposed pacifists, managed to eliminate over 300 trained soldiers without sustaining a single casualty among their own? The answer had been simultaneously straightforward and devastating. They had known precisely what they were doing. Evidence indicated that the humans had been studying Valyrian technology, psychology, and military doctrine throughout the entire 60-cycle duration of their partnership. Every trade mission had been a reconnaissance operation. Every diplomatic gathering had been an intelligence-gathering exercise. Every display of weakness had been a carefully calculated performance engineered to encourage complacency. The humans hadn't been submitting to exploitation. They had been cataloging it. But even more unsettling than the deception was the methodology. The humans hadn't simply killed their captors. They had done so with a degree of systematic efficiency that implied extensive training and deliberate preparation. These were not panicked civilians fighting for survival. These were operators executing a mission with military precision. The implications sent tremors of unease through the council chambers. If the humans had been orchestrating something like this from the beginning, what else lay within their capabilities? How many other species had misjudged them just as completely? The answer had arrived in the form of Jake himself. 3 days after the Kepler Station incident, long-range sensors had detected an enormous disturbance in the Proxima Centauri system. When scout vessels had arrived to investigate, they had discovered the entire Dolan trade fleet, 37 ships floating dead in space. No evidence of battle, no energy weapon discharge, no debris fields. The crews were simply gone. Security footage from the surviving vessels had told a strange story. A single human male, identified from the Kepler Station recordings as Jake, had somehow appeared aboard the Dolan flagship. He had walked the ship's corridors unarmed, unarmored, carrying nothing that could be identified as a weapon. Yet every Dolan he encountered had simply stopped breathing, stopped moving, stopped existing in any meaningful sense. Their bodies remained intact. Their expressions were peaceful. They appeared to have died without pain, without fear, without even awareness that death was approaching. Jake had passed through the entire fleet like a plague given human form, leaving nothing living in his wake. When the last vessel had gone silent, he had simply vanished, leaving behind only the echo of a transmission broadcast across all frequencies. The Accords are void. We remember everything. The Galactic Council had convened an emergency session within hours of receiving the report. Species that had spent decades extracting human labor suddenly found themselves re-examining every interaction they had ever had with the supposedly passive Terrans. Trade agreements were audited. Security protocols were overhauled. Military assets were quietly repositioned. But such precautions came far too late. The humans had vanished from known space entirely. Their trade routes fell silent. Their diplomatic missions were recalled. Their colonies in the Outer Rim simply emptied overnight. In a matter of days, humanity had become a ghost haunting the machinery of galactic civilization. The silence was more terrifying than any formal declaration of war could have been. For 2 cycles, the Council had waited for the inevitable. They had trained long-range sensors on human space, dispatched probe missions to their abandoned settlements, and attempted contact through every available channel. Nothing. It was as if humanity had simply chosen to erase itself from the galactic community, leaving behind vacant stations, silent worlds, and 1,000 unanswered questions about what they had been preparing all along. Then the ships had started disappearing. It began with isolated incidents in the Outer Rim territories. A Valyrian patrol that failed to report in. A Selene merchant vessel that never reached its destination. An Altarian mining operation that went dark between shift rotations. The pattern had taken months to become apparent. But when it did, the implications were staggering. Every missing vessel had been crewed by members of species that had participated in the exploitation of human labor. Every disappearance had occurred in sectors supposedly beyond human reach. And in each case, The ships had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the faintest energy signatures to confirm they had ever existed. The Council had attempted to dismiss it as coincidence. Pirates, perhaps, equipment failures, random misfortune in the vast emptiness of space. But the disappearances had continued, growing more frequent and more precisely targeted with each passing rotation. It was the Jandis Collective that had finally shattered the wall of denial. One of their medical research vessels, investigating a routine pathogen outbreak on a distant world, had transmitted a report that had chilled the Council to their core. The ship's sensors had detected an enormous object lurking within the system's asteroid belt, something that registered as larger than a Valyrian dreadnought, yet moved with the stealth profile of a fighter craft. When they had maneuvered to investigate, the object had revealed itself as a vessel of entirely unknown design. Its hull was smooth, flowing, almost organic in its contours. It generated no waste heat, no electromagnetic emissions, no gravitational distortions. Suppression that should have been physically impossible. And printed, along its side in characters readable from 1,000 kilometers away was a message, written in flawless Jandis script. "We have not forgotten what you did to our children." The medical ship had attempted to flee, but its engines had simply ceased functioning, not destroyed, not damaged, simply stopped, as though some invisible force had reached into their mechanical hearts and quieted them with a thought. The final transmission from the Jandis vessel had been a single terrified whisper. "There's a human aboard our ship. He's not armed. He's not threatening anyone. He's just walking, and everyone he passes just stops." The signal had cut off abruptly, leaving only static and the deepening certainty that humanity had been preparing for this moment far longer than anyone had dared imagine. The hunt for Jake had begun immediately. The Valyrian High Command, operating in consultation with the Galactic Council, had assembled the most expansive single-purpose military operation in recorded history. 500 of the most advanced warships in known space, crewed by elite warriors drawn from a dozen different species. They carried tracking systems capable of following a single molecule across star systems. They carried weapons capable of fracturing planets. They represented the combined military power of half the galaxy, all focused on a single target. One human male, last observed in the Kepler system, carrying nothing more formidable than his bare hands and an apparently inexplicable ability to make living beings simply cease to be. The irony was not lost on Commander Zathik. The very species they had dismissed as cowards now required the largest military mobilization in galactic history to contain a single individual. But after the Jandis incident, after the disappearing ships, after the dawning realization that they had been systematically deceived across 60 full cycles, no one was willing to take any chances. The fleet had dispersed across 17 star systems, constructing a net through which no single vessel could possibly slip undetected. Each ship carried the most advanced sensors available, programmed to identify the faintest trace of human life signs. Contingency plans had been developed for every conceivable scenario, with backup forces positioned to respond to any threat. What they lacked was any genuine understanding of what they were actually hunting. The first ship disappeared on day 4 of the operation. The Talon's Edge, a Valyrian heavy cruiser patrolling the outer boundary of the search grid, had simply gone quiet. No distress transmission, no sign of engagement, no debris field to mark its end. One moment it had been dutifully broadcasting its status every hour. The next it was gone. Commander Zathik had ordered an immediate investigation. 3 vessels had been dispatched to the Talon's Edge's last recorded coordinates, their crews briefed on every possible contingency and equipped with redundant communication systems. They had found nothing: empty space, natural background radiation, and a faint metallic quality in the local stellar wind that their sensors couldn't quite classify. But they had found the message, carved in flawless Valyrian script across the face of a nearby asteroid. Etched with a precision that spoke of advanced technology and infinite patience, was a simple declaration: Commander Zathik of the High Fleet, you are hunting the wrong prey. It was signed with a single human name. Jake, the second ship, disappeared that same day. Then the third. Then 7 more in rapid succession, scattered across the search perimeter with no apparent pattern or logic. Each disappearance was accompanied by a message carved into whatever surface lay nearby. Asteroids, derelict stations, the hull of a disabled cargo hauler that had been drifting through the system for cycles. Day 7. You have beautiful ships, Commander. I've always admired Valyrian engineering. Day 12. The crew of the Stellar Fury fought bravely. They deserve better than the orders they were given. Day 18. Do you know what your government did to the colony ships we sent to New Geneva? I do. The messages had grown increasingly personal as the hunt continued, revealing a depth of knowledge about Valyrian military operations that should have been impossible for any outsider to possess. Jake knew the names of their crew members, the specifications of their weapons, the details of classified missions buried in the deepest archives of the High Command. Worse, he appeared to understand exactly why each ship had been selected for the hunt. The Stellar Fury had participated in the seizure of a human medical transport. The Void Dancer had destroyed a Terran research station. The Ironclaw had been present. During the bombardment of the human colony on Theta Cygni, Jake wasn't merely hunting them. He was prosecuting them for war crimes they hadn't even known they had committed. By day 25, the fleet had been reduced to fewer than 400 ships. The remaining crews were beginning to fracture under the psychological strain of knowing they were being stalked by something they couldn't see, couldn't track, and couldn't engage. Some captains had formally requested withdrawal from the operation. Others had proposed abandoning the hunt and returning to Valyrian space. A few had suggested deploying their nuclear arsenals to sterilize every system in the search grid and hope their target was caught in the detonation. Commander Zathik had denied every request. The High Command had been unambiguous about the mission parameters. Jake was to be captured or eliminated, regardless of cost. Too many questions surrounded his capabilities, and too many powerful individuals wanted answers. But, as his fleet continued to bleed ships with each passing day, Zathik was beginning to question whether the cost had already grown too steep. The breakthrough had come on day 31. The Shadow's Edge had detected an anomalous energy signature in the Barnard's star system. The readings corresponded to advanced human technology, something far beyond what the Terran Federation was supposed to possess. Zathik had ordered half the remaining fleet to converge on the coordinates, convinced that they had finally cornered their quarry. 200 ships had jumped into the system simultaneously, weapons charged and crews braced for anything. What they found was a single human vessel, small and sleek, hanging motionless in the space between two gas giants. It showed no indication of damage, no sign that it was attempting evasion. It simply waited, as though its pilot had been fully expecting them. "Open a channel," Zathik ordered. The face that materialized on the main display was unremarkable by human standards. Brown hair, pale complexion, eyes the color of deep water. But there was something within those eyes that made Zathik's scales prickle with instinctive, involuntary fear. "Commander Zathik," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly across the transmission. "Thank you for coming. We need to talk." "Surrender now and you will be treated in accordance with the Galactic Accords," Zathik replied, though his voice carried little conviction. The Accords had been rendered void the moment Captain Hector snapped his communicator, and everyone involved understood this perfectly. Jake smiled, and for the first time Zathik noticed the Predator's gleam behind his teeth. "I'm not here to surrender, Commander. I'm here to negotiate. You are in no position to make demands. You are outnumbered 200 to 1. "Am I?" Jake asked. "Are you entirely certain about that?" It was then that the sensors had erupted with new contacts, dozens of them, materializing throughout the system as though assembling from nothing. Each one was broadcasting human identification codes, but their energy signatures matched nothing in the Federation database. These were ships designed for war, not the improvised converted cargo haulers the humans had used in previous encounters, but purpose-built instruments of destruction that made Valyrian dreadnoughts look like scale models by comparison. "Where did these come from?" Zathik whispered. "We've kept ourselves occupied during our 60 cycles of peaceful cooperation," Jake replied. "Did you genuinely believe we were sitting quietly while you robbed us blind?" The human fleet had arranged itself into attack formation with a coordination that spoke of extensive training and preparation, yet made no aggressive moves, took no hostile action. They simply waited, as if extending the Valyrians the courtesy of time to absorb what they were witnessing. "You've been planning this," Zathik said, the words tasting like ash. "Planning what?" Jake asked. "We haven't fired a single shot. We haven't issued any demands. We're simply here. The missing ships, the crews that vanished, that was you." Jake's expression had cooled. "Those crews participated in the systematic exploitation and murder of my people across 60 cycles. They were given opportunities to surrender, to account for their actions, to make reparations. Most chose to fight instead, and those who didn't fight are still alive, somewhere safe, being shown better ways to understand the universe. The implication had sent ice flooding through Zathic's veins. The humans hadn't been eliminating their prisoners. They had been reshaping them, re-educating them, transforming them into something else entirely. "What do you want from us?" Zathic asked. Jake leaned back in his pilot's seat, hands folded with apparent calm. "What I want is beside the point, Commander. The question is what you are prepared to offer. I don't understand. Allow me to be more precise. Your government has spent 60 cycles stealing from us, enslaving our people, and treating us as a resource to be consumed. You have taken our children, our worlds, our trust. You have murdered our colonies and congratulated yourselves afterward." Zathic could hear his crew shifting nervously behind him, their claws scraping against deck plating in involuntary displays of agitation. The Council was operating under the assumption that— "The Council," Jake interrupted, "was operating under the assumption that we were too powerless to respond. That assumption has now been corrected. So this is a declaration of war." Jake shook his head slowly. "No, Commander. This is a declaration of justice. War implies that both sides have a meaningful chance of prevailing." The transmission ended without warning, leaving the Valyrian fleet alone with their thoughts, and the deepening certainty that they were confronting something that existed far beyond their comprehension. For 6 hours, the two fleets had faced each other in absolute silence. The humans made no move to attack. Neither did they show any inclination to withdraw. They simply waited, as though they possessed all the time the universe had to offer. It was Commander Zathic who had finally broken. The accumulated strain of losing ship after ship, crew after crew, had ground his nerves down to nothing. He had witnessed enough death for 10 lifetimes, and the prospect of watching his remaining forces be dismantled one by one was more than he could endure. "All ships," he broadcast, his voice carrying the desperation of a commander who had run out of other options. "Weapons free. Take them down." The battle had lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. The Valyrian fleet had unleashed everything at its disposal. Pulse cannons, plasma torpedoes, antimatter warheads capable of fracturing moons. The space between the two forces had blazed like a newborn star, as enough destructive power to level entire continents was discharged at point-blank range. When the light had faded, the human ships were untouched. Weapons that should have vaporized entire squadrons had passed through their hulls, like shadows dissolving in mist. Energy blasts that should have boiled their crews alive had been absorbed, redirected, or simply disregarded entirely. Then the humans had responded. They had not deployed energy weapons. They had not launched missiles or torpedoes or any conventional instrument of space combat. Instead, they had simply reached out. Invisible forces had seized Valyrian vessels and compressed them like insects beneath a thumb. Massive dreadnoughts had been folded in half by energies that generated no detectable signature. Crews had found themselves adrift in open space, their ships crumpled around them like discarded paper. Within minutes, the Valyrian fleet had been reduced to scattered debris and emergency escape pods. The humans had made no effort to destroy the survival vessels or hunt the survivors. They had simply neutralized the threat and moved forward. Commander Zathic had found himself alone in an escape pod, watching as Jake's vessel approached with calm, predatory grace. The human had docked manually, the airlocks mating with a precision that suggested intimate familiarity with Valyrian engineering. When the airlock cycled open, Jake stood there in person for the first time. He was smaller than Zathic had anticipated, more physically fragile in appearance. But there was something in his eyes that made the Valyrian commander's blood go cold. "Hello, Commander," Jake said pleasantly. "I apologize for the accommodations. Escape pods weren't designed with comfort in mind. What are you?" Zathic whispered. Jake considered the question with genuine seriousness. "I'm what happens when a peaceful species is pushed beyond its breaking point," he said finally. "I'm what my people become when you murder our children, steal our worlds, and expect us to express gratitude for the privilege." The Council didn't know. "The Council knew precisely what it was doing," Jake interrupted. "You documented every crime, cataloged every theft, filed reports on every atrocity. You were proud of what you were accomplishing. You believed we were too ignorant to comprehend what was being done to us." Zathic felt his mandibles trembling. "What are you going to do with me?" Jake smiled, and Zathik saw the shadow of something final waiting behind his expression. "I'm going to give you a choice, Commander. You can come with me, learn the truth about what your people have done, and help us construct something better. Or you can remain here in this pod and wait for your government to send a rescue vessel. And if I choose to stay? Then you'll have ample time to reflect on the kind of universe you helped build. The pod has life support for approximately 40 days. Jake paused. After that, well, space is an extraordinarily cold place to die alone. It hadn't been much of a choice. Zathik had followed Jake aboard his ship, a vessel that defied every established principle of known engineering. The corridors were broader than standard design, the ceilings higher, as though the craft had been conceived by beings who understood space travel on an entirely different foundational level. The technology was seamless, integrated, alive in ways that made Valyrian construction look like crude mechanical assembly. "How long have you been capable of building ships like this?" Zathik had asked, his eyes moving across surfaces that seemed to shift and breathe with quiet intelligence. "We've always been capable of building ships like this," Jake had replied without looking back. "We simply chose not to." He said it the way someone might explain why they had declined to show a hand of cards at a table, where the stakes hadn't yet justified the revelation. It seemed impolite. He added, they had traveled for days through hyperspace, passing systems that appeared on none of Zathik's known star charts, worlds that showed no inhabited designations in any Federation database. But Jake's navigation systems had tracked their course with absolute precision, following routes that seemed to exist outside the conventional geometry of space and time. When they had finally arrived at their destination, Zathik had understood why humanity had vanished so completely from known space. They hadn't abandoned the galaxy. They had simply stopped pretending to occupy only a small corner of it. The system they entered contained a dozen worlds, each one alive with human population and industry. Massive orbital shipyards stretched between the planets like metallic webbing, producing vessels that made the ship which had transported him look elementary by comparison. The population readings were staggering. Billions of humans, all moving with the concentrated determination of a species that had been gravely wronged and was methodically preparing to make it right. "This is impossible," Zathik had breathed. The Federation census showed human population at perhaps 2 billion. You don't have the numbers to sustain an operation of this magnitude. Jake had laughed, a sound entirely absent of warmth. "The Federation observed what we allowed it to observe, Commander. Did you genuinely believe we would reveal our true strength while you were treating us as property?" They had landed on the third planet, a world that hummed with restless purpose in every direction. Zathik had been escorted through facilities that extended beyond the horizon, filled with technologies that challenged his understanding of physics at its most fundamental level. Humans worked alongside machines that appeared to reason and reflect, constructing weapons that seemed to exist simultaneously across multiple dimensions. But it was not the technology that had shaken him most profoundly. It was the humans themselves. Gone entirely was the passive, accommodating manner he had come to associate with their species. These humans moved with authority, spoke with conviction, and regarded him with eyes that carried the weight of 60 cycles of accumulated grievance. They had been wronged in ways that most civilizations never recover from, and they had spent those 60 cycles not collapsing beneath the burden, but quietly sharpening themselves against it. Then they had shown him the records, every theft, every killing, every casual act of cruelty that the so-called civilized species of the galaxy had inflicted on humanity during their supposed partnership. The data was exhaustive, damning, and absolutely impossible to dispute. The colony ship New Horizon, carrying 15,000 human civilians toward a new world, had been intercepted by Valyrian forces. Its passengers had been sold into slavery. The official report had classified the vessel as lost in transit due to navigational error. The research station at Wolf 359, where human scientists had been developing new agricultural methods to feed the galaxy's expanding population, had been raided by Sleen military units. The researchers had been killed. Their work had been stolen. Their discoveries had been claimed by their murderers. The official report had cited equipment malfunction, resulting in total loss of life. The children's hospital ship Bright Hope, carrying medical provisions to human settlements in the Outer Rim, had been destroyed by an Altarian battle group that had designated it a military transport. The official report had never been filed at all. 60 cycles. Jake said quietly as they moved through the files. 60 cycles of systematic genocide, and your people called it commerce. Zathik had stared at the cascading data streams in mute horror. We didn't know. The reports we received were lies, Jake finished. Written by people who understood exactly what they were doing and exactly how to conceal it from those above them. But why? Zathik had pressed, the question tearing itself loose from somewhere deeper than tactical analysis. Why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you tell us what was happening to you? Jake had turned to face him then, and Zathik had seen something in his expression that was more difficult to absorb than anger or hatred could ever have been. Something far worse, disappointment, because we believed in what the Galactic Council was supposed to represent, Jake said. We believed that cooperation between species was genuinely possible, that different civilizations could contribute to something greater than any one of them alone. We believed that if we demonstrated our trustworthiness, if we proved our value without demanding recognition for it, we would eventually be welcomed as equals. He paused. And now we know better. They had shown him the ships then. Not the sleek combat vessels that had dismantled the Valyrian fleet, but the others. The ones that stretched for kilometers, bristling with armaments that partially existed outside normal spacetime. Ships that could traverse the distance between stars without conventional hyperspace, that could engage targets across galactic distances without warning, and that carried weapons designed not to conquer worlds, but to unmake them entirely. How many of these do you have? Zathik had asked, his voice barely audible. Enough, Jake had replied. We've been constructing them since the day we understood what the galaxy truly thought of us. Every insult, every theft, every murdered child has been carefully recorded and added to the ledger of what is owed. A debt ledger. Every species that participated in our exploitation is accountable for that participation, Commander. Some debts can be settled through reparations and honest acknowledgement. Others. Jake had gestured toward the fleet of impossible warships arrayed across the orbital lanes. Require more direct methods of collection. Zathik had felt his legs begin to fail beneath him as the full weight of what he was being shown crashed over him. You're planning to destroy the Federation. Not destroy. Jake had corrected with quiet precision. Correct. There is a meaningful distinction. They had brought him to the command center then, a vast chamber filled with humans monitoring activity across the entire galaxy. Star charts displayed the positions of every major fleet, every strategically significant world, every critical resource that Federation civilization depended on for its continued function. And at the center of it all stood a human male who introduced himself simply as Thomas. He was older than Jake, with silver threading through his hair and lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years spent carrying burdens most beings would have broken beneath. But there was a gravitational quality to his presence, as though reality itself bent slightly in his vicinity. Commander Zathik, Thomas said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the vast chamber. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Invitation, Zathik had repeated, the word carrying a bitter edge. I was captured. You were given a choice, Thomas had corrected, his tone gentle but immovable. Jake could have left you to perish in that escape pod. Instead, he brought you here so that you could witness what your people's choices have produced. He had gestured toward the displays surrounding them, showing the real-time progress of human operations spread across the galaxy. Ships in motion, resources being repositioned, populations being prepared for something vast and irrevocable. What are you planning? Zathik had asked. Justice, Thomas replied simply. For 60 cycles, your people treated us as animals. You extracted our resources, murdered our civilians, and enslaved our children. And throughout all of it, you told yourselves it was acceptable because you believed we lacked the capacity to respond. So you intend to wage war against the entire galaxy, Zathik said. Thomas had shaken his head slowly. War implies that both sides have a meaningful chance of winning, Commander. What we're planning is more akin to pest control. The casual register in which he spoke of civilizational collapse had made Zathik's blood crystallize with cold. You can't be serious. There are trillions of beings across the Federation. Innocent civilians who had nothing to do with. Innocent? Thomas had interrupted, his voice acquiring an edge that seemed to alter the atmospheric pressure in the room. Where were these innocent civilians when our children were being auctioned into slavery? Where were they when our colonies were burning? Where were they when we appealed to the Council for Justice and were instructed to be grateful for the honor of serving our betters. Thomas had moved to one of the displays, bringing up images that made Zathic's stomach contract. Human children in chains, human scientists being subjected to vivisection in the name of medical advancement, human families being broken apart and distributed to different sectors of the galaxy, like sorted inventory. Every species within the Federation was aware of what was happening, Thomas continued. They reviewed the reports, witnessed the atrocities, and elected to look away, because looking away was profitable. They are complicit in every crime committed against my people. But surely, you cannot condemn entire civilizations for the conduct of their governments. Can't we? Jake had said, stepping forward to enter the conversation. When the Valyrians were enslaving our children, where were the Valyrian citizens demanding that it stop? When the Selene were conducting experiments on our people, where were the Selene protests? When the Altarians were destroying our ships for entertainment, where was the Altarian outrage? Zathic had found himself without an answer. The truth, the uncomfortable, inescapable truth, was that most Federation citizens had been either uninformed about the human situation or quietly supportive of it. Inexpensive goods and accessible labor had made existence comfortable for everyone, except the humans who had produced them. There were some who objected, he said weakly. A handful, Thomas acknowledged. Perhaps 1 in a million. We've identified them. He paused. They'll be spared what's coming. And the rest? Thomas had looked at him with the cold arithmetic of historical necessity in his expression. The rest will learn what it means to be without recourse. They had shown him the plan then, in its full and terrible completeness. It was not a military campaign in any conventional understanding. It was the systematic deconstruction of galactic civilization, performed with the patient precision of a master craftsman, disassembling a complex and dangerous machine. Phase 1 was already in motion. Human operatives had embedded themselves within every significant government, every military command structure, every critical infrastructure network across the Federation. They had spent decades mapping the vulnerabilities of their adversaries, charting their dependencies, and positioning themselves for the moment when their patience reached its natural terminus. Phase 2 would activate simultaneously across 17 star systems. Key military installations would simply cease to function. Not destroyed, not physically damaged, simply rendered inoperative by humans who understood alien engineering better than the engineers who had created it. Fleets would find themselves motionless in open space, their propulsion dead, their weapons silent. Phase 3 would target the arteries of galactic civilization. Trade routes would be severed. Communication networks would go dark. The delicately balanced economy that sustained dozens of species in uneasy coexistence would unravel in a matter of days. And Phase 4? Zathic had asked. Phase 4 is where it becomes instructive, Thomas said, his voice carrying the gravity of absolute certainty. That's when we introduce our friends to the concept of accountability. He had shown Zathic the tribunal ships. Massive vessels designed to function as mobile courts for the prosecution of crimes against humanity. Each one was staffed by human jurists who had spent decades mastering the legal frameworks of their adversaries, learning their statutes, their precedents, their own established definitions of civilized conduct. We're going to try them according to their own legal systems, Jake explained. Every act of theft will be prosecuted under Valyrian commercial law. Every killing will be adjudicated according to Selene military justice. Every instance of enslavement will be evaluated using Altarian civil statutes. That's impossible. The legal frameworks of different species are fundamentally incompatible. Are they? Thomas asked. We've spent 60 cycles studying them, Commander, and do you know what we discovered? He waited, letting the silence build. They all share one defining characteristic. Every single one of them classifies the systematic exploitation of other species as a capital offense. The irony had been devastating in its elegant simplicity. The Federation species had condemned themselves using the instruments of their own jurisprudence. They had constructed legal systems that explicitly prohibited the very actions they had been perpetrating against humanity for 6 decades. And then they had gone right on committing them, confident that the prohibition would never be enforced against them. The tribunals will be thorough, Thomas continued. Every individual who participated in crimes against humanity will receive a fair trial according to the legal standards governing their own species. They'll be provided with competent legal representation, access to all relevant evidence, and the presumption of innocence until guilt is established. Those found guilty will face the sentences prescribed by their own justice systems for precisely these offenses. He folded his hands. We are not imposing human law upon alien civilizations, Commander. We are simply ensuring that their own laws are applied with fairness and consistency, without the exemptions and special accommodations that have always previously applied. It was, Zathik had realized, the most comprehensive act of retribution in the history of recorded civilization, disguised as a legal proceeding. The humans weren't planning to conquer the Federation. They were planning to prosecute it into dissolution using the Federation's own rulebook. How long? Zathik had asked, the word coming out hollowed of everything except the need to know. How long have you been building toward this? Since the day we understood what you truly thought of us, Thomas replied. Did you know that the Terran Federation began as nothing more than a trading consortium? We never intended to become a military power. All we ever wanted was to engage in galactic commerce, to share what we had learned, to grow alongside other species. What changed? The first time one of your ships fired on a human civilian transport, Jake said quietly. The first time we recognized that our goodwill was being read as vulnerability. The first time we understood that peace was only possible between parties who regarded each other as equals. So you decided to make yourselves our equals. Thomas had laughed, a sound that contained no humor, only resolution. No, Commander. We decided to become your superiors. They had kept Zathik aboard through the following weeks, showing him the full scope of human preparation. He had witnessed factories that produced matter from pure energy. He had watched soldiers who moved through hard vacuum without environmental protection, as though it were nothing more uncomfortable than a stiff breeze. He had observed human children mastering disciplines that would have reduced Federation scientists to bewildered silence. Humanity had not merely been preparing for conflict, they had been evolving toward it. How is any of this possible? Zathik had asked during one of his conversations with Jake. Your species should not be capable of technological advancement at this scale. Who told you what our species was capable of? Jake replied. Zathik had no answer. The same people who told you we were cowards, Jake said. The same people who assured you we were primitive. The same people who had every reason in the galaxy to make sure you underestimated us. The question had settled in the room like sediment. Everything the Federation had ever understood about humanity had come from human sources. Scientists who had shared their research with apparent openness. Diplomats who had answered every inquiry with evident candor. Traders who had provided exhaustive information about their worlds and productive capabilities. All of it had been fabricated, careful, calculated deceptions engineered to ensure that their exploiters would never see the response coming until it had already arrived. You've been studying us for 60 cycles, Zathik said slowly, learning our weaknesses, our fears, the places where we can't see clearly. We've been learning how to hurt you, Jake corrected. There is a difference, and now you believe you're ready. Jake had grown quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the stars beyond the viewport, with an expression that carried the entire accumulated weight of grief and fury and something older than either. Ready, Commander? When he finally spoke, his voice was measured in the way of a person who has carried an enormous weight for so long that it has become indistinguishable from their own skeleton. We have been ready since the day the first human child died in a Valyrian labor camp, since the day the first human scientist was dissected for Sleene medical research, since the day the first human colony was destroyed for Altarian amusement. Then why wait? Why spend 60 cycles gathering intelligence when you could have acted sooner? Because we needed certainty, Thomas said, joining as he often did when the conversation reached philosophical depths. We needed to understand fully what we were facing. We needed to map every crime, identify every perpetrator, document every injustice beyond any possibility of dispute. And now you have. And now we have, Thomas confirmed, his voice quiet with the weight of everything that confirmation implied. And now it is time to collect on the debts that are owed. The return to Valyrian space had taken only hours, a journey that by conventional hyperspace should have required days. Jake's vessel had moved through dimensions that Federation science still classified as purely theoretical, arriving at coordinates calculated for maximum psychological impact. They had emerged from their impossible transit directly above the Valyrian homeworld. their ship's signature announcing their presence to every sensor array in the system. Within minutes, they were surrounded by the planetary defense fleet, 200 vessels, armed and prepared. "This is Admiral Krosk of Valyrian Home Defense." A voice crackled across every open frequency. "Unknown vessel. Identify yourself and state your purpose." Thomas had activated the ship's transmitter, his voice carrying with absolute clarity. "This is Thomas of the Terran Federation. I am here to discuss terms." "Terms?" Admiral Krosk had sounded genuinely bewildered. "Terms for what?" "The peaceful surrender of your government to stand trial for crimes against humanity." The silence that followed had been total. Zathik could imagine the cascading disorder erupting through Valyrian command channels as officers attempted to process what they were hearing. "You are one ship against our entire defense fleet," Admiral Krosk had finally responded. "What gives you grounds to dictate terms to us?" "The same thing that allowed me to pursue 500 of your warships, using nothing more than a maintenance technician and a small craft." Thomas replied with complete composure. Another silence, longer this time and heavier. "What do you want?" Krosk asked at last, his voice measurably quieter. "Justice," Thomas said. "For 60 cycles your people have committed atrocities against mine. We have documented every crime, identified every perpetrator, and calculated the appropriate restitution. You have one path forward. Submit to trial under your own legal framework and accept the consequences of your actions." "And if we refuse?" Thomas smiled. And even though the Admiral couldn't see his expression, something in the quality of his silence communicated the precise weight of what stood behind it. "Then you will discover why Jake was the least dangerous human I could have sent to find you." The negotiation had continued for hours. The outcome had never genuinely been in question. The Valyrians could fight, certainly. They could fortify their home world and prepare for a siege that might consume cycles. But they had witnessed what one ordinary human maintenance technician could accomplish alone, and the thought of what Thomas might deploy in response to sustained resistance had proven too enormous to absorb. The Valyrian High Command had surrendered before sunset. The trial had been a work of legal craftsmanship, conducted according to Valyrian law, presided over by Valyrian judges, and prosecuted using evidence drawn from Valyrian archives. The humans had done nothing more radical than ensure the law was applied completely, and without exception, without the customary exemptions and procedural conveniences that had historically allowed atrocities to go unaddressed. The verdicts had been unanimous, guilty on all counts. The sentences had been carried out according to Valyrian tradition. Exile to the prison world of Ketha, where the convicted would spend the remainder of their lives in contemplation of their actions. It was a sentence many of them had imposed on human prisoners across the decades, never once imagining that they might one day inhabit the same circumstances. But, even as justice was being administered, Zathik found himself haunted by a question his human hosts seemed consistently reluctant to answer directly. "What happens next?" he had asked Thomas during one of their evening conversations, as the last verdicts were still being recorded. "Next," Thomas said, giving the word the weight of a turning point, "we proceed to the Selene Empire. Then the Altarians. Then, every other species that determined human suffering was an acceptable cost of their comfort." "How many more like Jake do you have?" Thomas smiled, but there was something genuinely sorrowful in the expression. "Commander, Jake isn't exceptional. He isn't enhanced, modified, or unique in any particular way. He is simply human." Zathik stared at him. "I don't understand." "Every human can do what Jake does," Thomas explained. "The capacity to move without detection, to neutralize technology through direct contact, to make adversaries simply cease to be present. These are not superhuman abilities, Commander. They are simply what we are." The revelation struck Zathik like a physical impact. "All of them, every human, every adult human, yes. It is a natural function of our basic physiology, as unremarkable to us as drawing breath." Thomas paused. "We spent 60 cycles pretending these abilities didn't exist, because we thought concealing them would make the rest of the galaxy more comfortable in our presence. But that's impossible. The Federation has studied human biology extensively. The Federation studied what we permitted it to study," Thomas interrupted. "Do you genuinely believe we would have disclosed our true nature to species who were already exploiting us?" Zathik thought about Jake walking through Valyrian vessels and leaving nothing living behind him. He thought about the disappearing ships, the undetectable technology, the calm and absolute confidence with which these humans discussed the restructuring of galactic civilization. "How many of you are there?" he whispered. "Truly?" Thomas crossed to the chamber's primary display and brought up a star chart that showed human space in its actual extent. Not the handful of cataloged systems the Federation had identified, but hundreds of worlds, thousands of installations, populations numbering in the hundreds of billions. "Enough," Thomas said simply. The conversation had ended there, but its implications had continued propagating through Zathic's consciousness for days afterward, branching and multiplying into territories he could find no framework to contain. If every human possessed capabilities that edged against the supernatural, if their technology was centuries in advance of anything the Federation could produce, if their actual population was orders of magnitude beyond what anyone had estimated, then the galaxy was preparing to change in ways that no power could forecast and no force could prevent. The trial of the Valyrian High Command had concluded with sentences that would echo across historical memory. But watching the convicted being escorted away to their exile, Zathic had understood with quiet certainty that this was only the beginning of something that had no visible end. Thomas had approached him one final time before his departure. "You have a choice to make, Commander," the human said. "You can return to your people and warn them about what is coming. You can help them understand the full scale of what they have done and the accountability that awaits them. And if I do, then perhaps some of them will be better prepared for what comes next." Zathic had been provided with a ship, a small Valyrian courier that had been modified with human technology to make it faster than anything in the Federation's active inventory. He had been given comprehensive records of every crime committed against humanity, accompanied by verified visual evidence that no reasonable party could dismiss or explain away. "Why are you releasing me?" he had asked as he prepared to depart. "Because someone needs to carry the account," Thomas had replied. "Someone needs to explain to the galaxy why this is happening, why it was always going to happen, and why nothing they do now can alter what comes next. We want them to understand that they authored this themselves." The 3-day return journey to Valyrian space had given Zathic time to review the evidence repeatedly, searching for any flaw in the human case, any argument that might soften the judgment that was coming. He found none. Every document was authenticated. Every image was verified. Every testimony was corroborated across multiple independent sources. The humans had constructed an irrefutable record. Not of their own destruction, but of the systematic dismantlement of their civilization by species who had disguised their crimes behind bureaucratic language and diplomatic courtesy. When he had finally delivered his report to Valyrian Command, the response had been predictable: denial, outrage, attempts to discredit both the evidence and the messenger. Some officials had accused him of psychological manipulation by human technology. Others had suggested the entire episode was an elaborate fabrication designed to fracture Federation unity. But the thoughtful ones, the officials who had read the materials carefully and grasped their implications, had begun making quiet preparations for what was inevitable. It had not been sufficient. The Selene Empire had collapsed in a single day. Their entire military infrastructure had simply stopped functioning, as human operatives triggered sabotage systems that had been embedded years in advance. Their governing apparatus had been physically transported to Terran space for trial, leaving behind a population slowly awakening to the breadth of the crimes committed in their name. The Altarians had held out longer, nearly a week before their resistance gave way. Their warrior culture had demanded that they fight to the last. But fighting required functional weapons, and movement required ships that could navigate. When their technology failed them at the moment of their greatest need, they found themselves as defenseless as the human children they had once killed for sport. One by one, the great powers of the Federation had been neutralized. Not conquered, not annihilated, simply stripped of the capacity to project authority beyond their own planetary systems, and compelled to face the accounting they had avoided for 60 cycles. Through all of it, the humans had maintained their posture of civilized legal process. Every action justified by existing Federation law, every sentence executed according to established precedent, every prosecution conducted with scrupulous fidelity to due process. It was justice, delivered at absolute zero, cold enough to burn. The trial of the Federation Council itself had been transmitted across the galaxy. Every inhabited world had witnessed the proceedings, conducted within the council's own chambers, presided over by their own appointed judges, prosecuted under their own codified rules of evidence. The humans had ensured nothing more and nothing less than that the law was applied without favor. The testimony had consumed 7 days and had exposed the complete architecture of the crimes perpetrated against humanity. The verdicts had been delivered, guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to commit genocide, systematic enslavement, crimes against sentience. The sentences had been carried out. Not through energy weapons or military force, but through the slow and irrevocable death of a civilization that had forfeited its moral standing to govern. The Federation Council had been dissolved, its authority transferred to a new governing body composed entirely of species that had once been its victims. Humanity had not sought dominion within this new arrangement. They had simply ensured that those who would hold authority going forward would carry within them the memory of what power without accountability had cost. Zathik had observed the proceedings from his quarters aboard a human observation vessel, attempting to absorb the magnitude of the transformation that had swept through the galaxy in a matter of weeks. The old order was gone, swept away as completely as debris before a solar wind. In its place was something nascent, something that prioritized accountability over convenience and proportionate justice over profit. It should have felt like resolution. The corrupt officials who had enabled 6 decades of atrocity were gone. The systems that had permitted such exploitation were being dismantled and reconstructed. The voices of those who had been silenced were finally being heard, but watching species after species submit to human judgment, Zathik had found himself troubled by a question he could not silence. Had they simply exchanged one form of absolute authority for another? The thought had disturbed him enough that he had sought out Thomas for a final conversation. "What happens now?" Zathik had asked. "When the trials are concluded, when the guilty have faced their consequences, when the new governance is established, what becomes of humanity? What becomes of the power you've accumulated?" Thomas had been quiet for an extended moment, his eyes fixed on the stars beyond the viewport with an expression that resisted easy reading. "That," Thomas said at last, "is the question that keeps me awake. You don't know. We know what we hope will happen." Thomas replied carefully. "We want to withdraw, to return to our own space and begin the long process of healing what 60 cycles of oppression have damaged within our own people. We want to go home. But power is considerably easier to accumulate than it is to relinquish," Thomas admitted. "And there are voices among my people who argue that the galaxy cannot safely govern itself without human involvement. They believe that what was done to us will be done to someone else if we step back, and they may not be wrong. They want to rule. They want to prevent what happened from ever happening to anyone again. They believe the only reliable guarantee is permanent human oversight of galactic governance." Thomas paused. "The distinction between those two motivations is narrower than it should be." "And what do you believe?" Thomas had turned to face him, and in his expression, Zathik had seen something that surprised him entirely. Something that looked, against all probability, like hope. "I believe every species deserves the opportunity to demonstrate that it can exceed its worst impulses," Thomas said. "I believe that, given the chance and the right circumstances, most beings choose better than they have chosen before." He paused again. "But I also believe that trust, once genuinely broken, requires generations to rebuild, and I don't know whether we have that kind of patience left. So what will you do?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted quietly, "but I suspect the decision won't ultimately be mine to make." The conversation had ended without resolution, but its weight had traveled with Zathik as he prepared for his final departure. "Tell them what you've witnessed," Thomas had instructed as Zathik boarded his ship. "Tell them what humanity is capable of, and what we have chosen, so far, not to do. Tell them that the era of exploitation is finished, and that what follows depends entirely on the choices they make from this moment forward. And if they choose poorly," Thomas had smiled, a slow, certain expression that contained no warmth and no ambiguity, "then they will discover that Jake was only the beginning." As Zathik's ship had pulled away from human space, carrying him back toward a future that bore no resemblance to the one he had once been able to imagine, he had found himself thinking about identity and about the promises concealed within the names that civilizations chose for themselves. The humans had never selected an epithet when they joined the Federation. They had allowed others to name them, to categorize them, to reduce them to whatever convenient simplification served the needs of those doing the reducing. But now, crossing through space that had been swept clean of the old Federation's reach, Zathik thought he finally understood what the humans deserved to be called. They were those who remember. And as his ship approached the fractured remnants of the Galactic Council, bearing news that would permanently alter the distribution of power across the known galaxy, Zathik found himself wondering what other promises lay sleeping within the names that species chose for themselves, and what it would cost, in the cost, cycles to come, to keep them. Behind him, in the depths of human space, 500 empty Valyrian warships drifted in perfect, silent formation around a maintenance technician named Jake, who sat alone in his small vessel and held the weight of choices not yet made. The galaxy had learned what humanity was capable of when driven past endurance. It had yet to discover what humans might become when they finally stopped performing weakness for the comfort of those who had benefited from believing in it. And in the silence between the stars, Jake allowed himself a quiet smile and began calculating coordinates for his next destination. The hunt was over. The reckoning had only just begun.